So we're now going to walk through the client-related class implementations and see how they work. As usual, you can find this in my live lessons GitHub repository in the folder WebMVC with the project EX4. So here we are on the client side of the EX4 project. We're going to take a look at a couple different places here. First, let's take a look at QuoteClient. So here's the QuoteClient class. You can see it's a component. It's auto-wired to an instance of proxy. You can see that its methods just turn around and forward to the appropriate proxy. These are all very simple, just kind of pass-through methods that do forwarding, nothing particularly insightful or complicated here. Let's go take a look at QuoteProxy. So you can see the QuoteProxy is auto-wired to the QuoteAPI. Here is the QuoteAPI. The QuoteAPI is the retrofit interfaces that we talked about before. This is what we could generate, for example, with ChatGPT. And let's just take a quick look at what these interfaces are saying. They're a little bit interesting, and they don't quite use the same annotation names as the controller does, which is why ChatGPT is nice to help do the mapping for us. So here's get all quotes. That's going to go and return all the quotes from a given service, microservice, which is identified by the route name parameter. And we annotate that with the path annotation, which is a retrofit way of saying, make this be the path that we're going to put into the request so that the API gateway can know which microservice to route it to, and then it'll strip that part out. So that's going to return a call object to a list of quotes, and we're going to say get is going to be the route name, which is this parameter here, which is dynamically set, followed by get all quotes. So it's going to impose or prefix the route name dynamically, followed by the get all quotes route path. Or it's kind of confusing, but it's basically making a route name that's going to include the microservice as the first part. Down here, get quote, as you can see, is going to do something very similar with the route name as a path, but it's also going to put in the quote ID, which is added as a query. Kind of know how to do that. Otherwise, it's very much the same. It's also a get request. Down here, we have our first post request, which is post quotes, which is going to take the route name, the list of quote IDs as the body to the post. So body at body goes with at post. And then we're also going to add the query parameter as part of the URL. That's going to go ahead and look things up by quote IDs. Then down here we do search. The first search is the one that does the search where we want to see if any of the queries are in a quote. Same route name goes first. List of queries is the body part of the post. And then we put the parallel as part of the URL. And that's going to return, again, a call object to a list of quotes when it's executed. And then the final piece of the puzzle here is the one that's going to search for everything. It's the and versus the or. And in this case, we give it the list of queries that we want to match in the body. The path goes first. We have a query param to indicate whether this gets run in parallel or not, which we ignore because we're letting the underlying JPA do the work. We don't really care how it does it. And then finally, we have the return of the call to a list of quotes. So that's what the QuoteAPI looks like. Here's what QuoteProxy does. As you can see, what QuoteProxy does is it takes the parameters that are passed to it. It calls the proxy methods that were generated automatically using Retrofit via the QuoteAPI field. So we get all the quotes with the route that's passed in, and that returns a call object, which we then execute. And each of these things looks exactly the same. They all call execute call. And if we go here and look at execute call, you can see what this does. It wraps everything up in a rethrow supplier to get rid of the annoying checked exception handling syntax in Java. We then take the call parameter, execute it, get the response, figure out if we succeeded, in which case the body of the response contains the item that we requested or the items that we requested, which in all these cases are lists of quotes. And if something goes awry, in that particular case, we then figure out what went wrong, looking at the error body, and then we throw an IO exception that comes back with the error message. So that's essentially what we do for the client side, here's the client beans. As you can see here, here's the get QuoteAPI bean that we talked about earlier that makes ourselves an instance of QuoteAPI. And just for kicks, I put in the quote legacy file that we talked about in the video about using ChatGPT to generate the QuoteAPI, just to demonstrate the bad old way of doing things where you have to hard code the proxies by hand, which is very tedious and error prone. So that's essentially the parts of the class here that deal with quotes and quote clients.